fine, no problem. Islam actually encourages to free slaves. So in my view, it's like discouraging to have slaves, meaning encouraging you to free slaves. It's one of the righteous deeds in Islam to free a slave.
Okay, do you have some hadith or something from the Quran?
The Quran, chapter 2, verse 177. That's righteousness in a nutshell in Islam.
Okay.
What is to be righteous, and one of the deeds of freeing a slave.
Okay.
That's clearly.
Okay.
So hadith is not about Quran. Quran is telling you to free a slave, and we know many hadiths which Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even once somebody was beating his slave. His companions were beating his slave because he was angry at him. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, now you have to free him.
Right.
You shouldn't have beat him. You should be. And he said to him, you're going to end up in hellfire. You're earning a fire for you. Then he got so scared. He said, I'm freeing this slave. He's free from now. So Islam is always encouraging you to free slave. For example, if you miss a fast deliberately, or you break a fast deliberately. If you break a fast deliberately, one of the ways to make up for that is freeing a slave. There's so many excuses to freeing a slave in Islam. And slave.
Do you want to do 2 minutes? 2 minutes. Where are they? It might just be easier.
Well,
we don't have to.
No, we don't have to. You go on.
Okay.
So that was my point I was trying to make.
So just quickly coming to that point, tell me if I've got this wrong. Muhammad found somebody beating a slave and said because you've beaten that slave has to be free. He
didn't say that. He said I'm paraphrasing it. I think the hadith says something about warned about the hellfire.
Okay.
I'm paraphrasing. Okay. I don't remember. Then that his companion got so scared. He said, "I'm freeing him now. You are free." He got scared of that.
Okay, so yes.
Because he crossed the limit. He shouldn't be abusing a slave like that. And Islam, slavery is not the concept like in the Western or the slavery in the recent times. Islam slavery means you feed them what you eat, you clothe them what you wear, and do not make them overwork.
So let me just
Islam slavery is different.
May I just respond?
Hadiths are full of that. Hadiths are full of that. But I wasn't prepared for that. She just caught me just like that. I can talk about it.
You did agree.
What did you agree on what?
You agreed to talk to me.
Yeah, I did. But I do not have those hadiths about me. But if you want, I can bring those hadiths next week. That Islam actually just tells you what was saying.
But let me just say. So you said that Muhammad disapproved of the beating of slaves. In a nutshell.
Sorry?
You said Muhammad disapproved of the beating of slaves. Correct? Roughly. Do you say that's right?
Exactly.
Because I'm just saying.
Because that man was beating a slave, I'm not clearly saying that beating period. I'm saying that he was beating it pretty bad.
Let me just respond to that point because we have other hadith where Muhammad actually gives his tacit approval to the beating of slaves. To read this.
Like you see that, yeah. What's the? Can you give me that? Is it Sahih hadith?
So this is reported Abu Dawud and Ibn Majah. Authentic.
Sorry?
5.46d. Okay, and it says.
What's which book is that?
Authentic.
Okay, Abu, let me just read it. Abu Bakr asked him about his camel. The servant replied, I lost it yesterday. At this, Abu Bakr got angry and said to him, you had only one camel to look after and you lost it. And he beat him. The Prophet smiled and said, look at this muhrim, Abu Bakr, what is he doing? And he kept on smiling and repeating this. So this poor slave is being beaten.
What did he say? What did he say?
The Prophet is just smiling. He's
what
not
was his words? Can you repeat the words a bit louder so everybody can hear that?
He's just not intervening and saying, please don't beat the slaves.
No, what did he say? What was his words?
Okay.
Okay.
The Prophet smiled and said, look at this muhrim Abu Bakr, what is he doing? And he kept on smiling and repeating this.
So
he says, what is
smiling means approval.
What do you think?
Or when he's saying, what is he doing? It was in disapproval. For example, somebody is beating his hand. What are you doing? And what are you doing? He's telling him what are you doing. He's not saying, oh, well done, you should be beating him. Actually, he's telling him what are you doing.
Okay, so are you saying that this is ambiguous, that he could have not been...
He's pointing out to him, you should know better, what are you doing? He was his companion, his best friend. So he's pointing out to him, you should know better, what are you doing? For example, come on, what are you doing? That doesn't mean I'm agreeing with you, we're just reminding you what you're doing.
Abbas, may I just say though,
it's not a
you seem like a nice fella. If you saw some
you look
guys...
like a nice lady as well. I know. It's my opinion.
The point is, right, if you saw two people being beaten up, you would try and stop it. You would look horrified. You wouldn't smile as if it's just like something to look at. It's some kind of entertainment. I just think that this does not put Muhammad in a good light. But we also have additional problems. We just have additional
That is not the perfect
Yeah.
example.
Okay.
If I have a friend, my lifelong friend, who done a lot of good things for me, me too, he's a very good man, he's a very charitable man, very good man, and then I seen him beating somebody, I just remind him, what are you doing? Just for him to know that he's doing something
Have
wrong.
you dealt with the New Testament statements that tell slaves to obey their masters even when they're cruel to you? Have you dealt with that?
That's right. And the Old Testament.
Have we dealt with
No, we just started. We just started.
I'm just having
In the New Testament, for example, it says, "You who are slaves must."
Oh, you want to take over with him?
I want to take over with you.
I'm just asking a quick question. If I
My very learned brother here.
Sorry,
Come on.
just a quick question with you. Just to let you know, by the way, the New Testament says in many places, you who are slaves must accept the authority of your masters and submit to them. Do whatever they tell you, even if they are cruel.
I think if we're going to do this, we're going to time it. I think it's better
this
that we
is,
time it.
this is 1
Can I respond,
1
please?
Peter chapter 2, verse 18.
Okay.
So the New Testament,
Paul is
if you
just
come across
busted
I think Paul can take over from here. Is all right? Because
I'm happy to take
Paul
over.
is here.
Defend that first, don't you think, Lizzie?
Okay.
What is it? What is it? Is it
I'm
okay with
wondering
you?
where you're getting your morals from, because your New Testament says even if you're a slave, you must obey cruel masters.
Actually, I like.
I
you
don't
getting your
want to
morality
have this
from?
discussion unless we're timing it.
But
Okay?
Lizzie, what's the problem?
Can we just time it? So do you want to
It says
talk
even if they are cruel.
to talk?
So you agree that cruel masters should be obeyed if you're a slave, do you? Do you agree that cruel masters
I don't want to
must be
continue
obeyed?
unless I get a chance to respond
I'm
and we
asking you.
time it.
I'm asking you,
And
do
we
you
time
believe-
it.
I actually wanted to add
Slave
also the Old
masters
Testament
must be
says.
obeyed.
Old Testament also says that, isn't it? If you beat a slave,
Many places.
if he doesn't die, then it's okay.
That's the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's the Old Testament. It's the Bible as well.
Yeah.
So that's quite
But
cruel
you
as
can
well,
say
isn't
you should follow the Old
it? You can
Testament.
beat them
I'm talking
as
about the
far
New
as you don't kill them.
Testament.
So can you answer that?
verse was that?
So
It's
what
the
do
same
you
thing.
get your standards
Okay,
from?
do
Because
you
the
see
New
what I mean?
Testament standards
Suddenly two
dictate.
people talking over each other. This is not a good way to have
Lizzie,
discussion.
he's already
I
said
want
he'll
to.
take over.
I want
He can
to
take over, and I'm willing. I'm willing. Is he okay? Yeah.
Can we do this 2 minutes? 2 minutes.
What are we doing? So what's the debate
So
about?
it's about slavery.
Right. Okay. But shall I start?
Wait, hang on. Can we have a
2
timekeeper,
minutes.
please?
Who's going to time? I do it myself, but I'm speaking, which is difficult to time.
I can.
So I'll start off, and I'll make the case. 2 points really about
2 minutes, yeah?
Christian hypocrisy and the real teaching of Islam. Okay, are you ready?
Yes,
Right.
start.
Now, Christians down here often come and talk to Muslims about slavery and how awful slavery is and how Muslims support slavery and so on. But the fact is, these Christians, you're an evangelical, I take it, aren't you? Evangelical, the New Testament says some remarkable things. Over and over, it says to slaves and to slave masters, slaves, obey your masters. For example, in 1 Peter 2:18, it says this: you who are slaves must accept the authority of your masters with all respect. Do what they tell you. Not just those who are kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. Even if they are cruel. So the New Testament tells slaves to submit to their slave owners. It doesn't say slave owners free your slaves. It doesn't say freedom. It says slaves must submit even to the cruelest of masters, presumably who beat and torture their slaves. The New Testament nowhere says they should be freed. It says they should obey their masters. So what are your morals? My question to Christians is, where do you get your morals from? Do you get it from the New Testament? They don't. They get their morality from somewhere else. Basically from the secular Western mores, liberal values.
Who are they?
But sorry?
Who are they?
They are the Christians down here. So I would say they're not really arguing as Christians, but as secular humanists who throw their own Bible under the bus because they're embarrassed by it. Over and over, the Bible says that that slaves are owned by their masters, should be obey them, that slaves are not to be free. It doesn't say that in the New Testament anywhere. So my charge is of secularism on the Christians, that they do not follow their Bible, they throw it under the bus, and then they have the temerity and the hypocrisy to criticize Muslims. And I'm saying that that is a false prospectus. So that's my argument. Over to you.
Okay, so we started this topic about slavery, and Paul has gone straight in there to the passage of 1 Peter 2 about submitting. Basically, slaves submit to your masters with all respect. But I think what Paul is using this example for is he's talking about Christians in general bearing up against unjust suffering. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God. So in a way, this is making the point that it's a little bit like what Jesus was saying with turn the other cheek and loving your enemies, okay? So I don't think, and also don't forget that actually what is meant by slave in the New Testament is probably more akin to what servant is today. People weren't slaves in the sense of, you think of the transatlantic slavery where they had absolutely no rights at all. It just meant that they were kind of bound to a family. In fact, in the King James Version of the Bible, they don't translate slave in the same way that the NIV and the ESV translates the Hebrew word as slave. They translate it much, the majority of the times they translate it as servant. And even doctors and lawyers and writers in one sense could be slaves in that they were in the service, they were in the economic service of another family. But I'd like to just come back to the original premise, I guess, of this argument, which is slavery in Islam and Christianity. And I just want to come back to the real basics, really, and ask a very simple question. So we know that Muhammad traded and owned slaves. He owned 26 male slaves and 10 female slaves, possibly more, but the 10 are the ones that we know that are named. He sanctioned the taking of women as sex slaves. There's this phrase all the way throughout the Quran called "Those who your right hand possess." I'd like Paul you to tell me, what do you think of this particular phrase? How do you justify those who your right hand possess?
This is the thing.
I think Lizzie is dealing in classic Christian spin. It's not really Christian, it's secular humanist spin. The Greek word that's translated as slavery is doulos. Go and look it up in a dictionary, D-O-U-L-U-S, and it means slaves. It doesn't mean like a butler or a maid, like she's trying to spin it. It means a slave. And Roman slaves had the most awful time. The masses of slaves, they worked down the mines, they were treated brutally. And do not forget what the New Testament repeatedly says, and I repeat it again, slaves, obey, submit to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also those who are cruel. Now, this is a terrible thing to say to another human being if they're in servitude and suffering. Do you really think you would counsel your brother and sister who's a Christian to submit to a cruel master? I think that's a terrible thing for you to suggest. Now, as regards authority in general, this is what the New Testament says about, see, the Roman Empire was built on slavery, the most appalling slavery, and this is what Paul in Romans says, and this applies to all systems throughout the world. Paul says in Romans chapter 13, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Now note that Paul wrote this when Nero, that hideous Roman emperor, was Caesar. He wrote this when Caesar was emperor in Rome. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. So Nero's rulership comes from God. And those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists this authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So basically, this is Paul is saying to people, slaves, your situation, your position is instituted by God. And if you resist slavery, you are going against what God has instituted. And this is a terrible outlook to have on life. So before you start criticizing other religions, you need to get your house in order, my dear.
Isn't it fascinating that I actually asked Paul, I said, now please can you respond to what the Quran says about this phrase, those whom your right hand possesses. And actually Paul didn't mention that not even once. He actually has gone straight back to the Bible. I actually answered his questions about this particular verse, and I've asked him, because don't forget that Muhammad is the example for Muslims for all mankind. Muhammad owned slaves, he traded slaves, he took sex slaves, and according to the Quran's own logic, what Muhammad did 1400 years ago is acceptable 1400 years ago, it's acceptable today, and it's acceptable in 100 years' time. So actually, taking sex slaves is even permitted. And now let's go back and let's see what the Quran actually says on this. Let's look at Surah 4:24. Okay, this is Muhammad speaking to people. He says, and prohibited to you, he's talking to men. Note that, he's not talking to women, he's just talking to the men. prohibited to you are married women, except those married women. So you're not allowed to have sex with women who are married, apart from, except those who your right hand possess. Okay, this is the degree of Allah upon you. Okay, and then let's go to Surah 33:50. O Prophet, we have made lawful to you your wives whom you have given their due compensation, and those your right hand possesses, from what Allah has returned to you of captives. These are women who are taken captive for the purposes of sexual gratification of their captors. Okay? Surah 33:52. Okay? Not lawful to you, O Muhammad, are women after this for you to exchange from other wives, even if their beauty were to please you, except what your right hand possesses. So you can have, you're not allowed to exchange your wives for other wives, but with your right hand possessors, you can basically do what you like. Paul, you didn't respond to that last time. I would really like it if you respond to it now, because you have taken the liberty that you have at Speaker's Corner to criticise my religion, and I have the liberty to criticise yours, and we respond to each other. Please, can you respond?
To be fair, you criticise my religion, you're right, but still, anyway.
Can you debate with me?
Right, to continue. The reason I will get on to this in a second, but I'm not going to let you get off the hook so easily, because my charge to you in my first opening statement, which you've ignored, is one of hypocrisy. And I asked you where you get your moral standards from. Let me tell you a little story. When de Klerk was president of South Africa, president of apartheid South Africa, he had a meeting with Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was brought from prison, the freedom fighter. He was brought to the Christian who was the head of South Africa, de Klerk. And de Klerk said, what right do you have, Nelson Mandela, to resist and fight apartheid? And do you know what de Klerk said? He quoted Paul. This is what you can look at, you can check this out. De Klerk said this to Nelson Mandela: let every person, Nelson Mandela, be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and whoever resists will incur judgment. Now, de Klerk was telling Nelson Mandela to submit to the ruling authorities, because Nelson Mandela was right, because he had God on his side, and he used the Bible to justify apartheid. And he had a point, because over and over again in the New Testament endorses and upholds slavery. So when this lady comes along, not from biblical principles, not using the Bible, but using secular, Western, liberal values to criticize Islam, she is practicing a deceit. She's practicing a lie, because she's not really a Christian when she argues that. She's coming at it as a Guardian reader, or a Daily Mail reader, or a BBC watcher. All those values are from there. They're not from her sacred text, which she throws under the bus because she never quotes from it. So I come back to you. When it says, do you condemn the Bible for saying to people who are cruelly oppressed by their slave owners, do you say to them to submit to their slaves or not? Or do you say, find freedom? What do you say?
Right, notice again that Paul has not talked at all about Islam.
Because you've not addressed my first point. I made the opening point. You have failed to address it.
Secondly, Secondly, also Paul himself is displaying a degree of hypocrisy here, because he says he's outraged by the very idea that God has appointed authorities and there's no authorities that God hasn't established, when actually he, as a Muslim, believes in Sharia, believes that there's only form of legitimate authority is God's authority, the Sharia law. So he cannot really put that charge against me, because it comes straight back to him. Now,
you can address the charge.
So he's still having. I would like Paul to. I don't know why he is so keen to not talk about this issue of sex slavery in Islam. Those who your right hand possess. He doesn't want to touch it at all. I don't blame him, because it's so abhorrent. It's so morally abhorrent.
I'm not going to terminate this, because I feel.
Don't run away, Paul.
And now he's running away. He's running away because he doesn't like this subject matter. But let me just finish. If Paul's going to walk away, he said, let's talk about how slaves should be corrupted. Actually, the New Testament does say that it says that slaves should try and get their freedom. Christians weren't in a position, they were too weak, they were persecuted. They weren't in a position to officially overthrow the whole system of slavery. But it's so interesting, isn't it, that it was Wilberforce in the 19th century who actually did that job, and that Britain was one of the first places where slavery was overthrown, and it took much later for Muslim countries to come along. But let's see how how even in the New Testament. Let's see how even in the New Testament what Paul says on the issue of slavery. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 7. Oh, might take a while. Sorry, freezing fingers. Can you find 1 Corinthians 7? Oh, the hand's there. Sorry. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 7, shall we? Okay. Okay. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. That's what Paul says. If you can gain your freedom, do so. He says don't let it trouble you, because actually what the Bible teaches is that the kind of slavery that all of us are in is far more troubling than our kind of work social situation. The Bible talks about us being slaves to sin, and that actually we need to be set free from that through the Son of God, and also in Philemon, Paul writes to Philemon saying, basically begging that he should be sent home Onesimus should be sent back to him as a beloved brother and no longer as a slave. So even though the system of servanthood, it's more like indentured servanthood than slavery was still in place, the whole thrust of the New Testament is towards freedom, and we don't see that in the Quran. All we see is the system of slavery just continuing on. And yes, there is some degree, if Paul would have stayed and debated me, but he didn't want to do that, yes, there are some measures of controls among slavery, but we still have these really troubling things. For example, this expression, those who your right hand possess, that's ISIS are practicing that today. We have lots of problems, but unfortunately Paul didn't want to talk about it.